He could have taken the empire. Instead, he burned it to the ground for her. But before Victor Castelli destroyed his family's entire kingdom, before the federal agents, the betrayal, and the scandal, there was just one terrified girl in his office trying to save her mother from debt. He offered her a ring, a contract, a fortune, and one impossible condition: give me an heir. She thought she was marrying for survival. She had no idea she was about to become the one woman powerful enough to make a mafia king choose love over empire.
Eels. Lena Park, age 23. The scene opens in the belly of the beast, an office where the air is thick with the scent of cigars and old money. She isn't here to plead. She is here to negotiate the terms of her own surrender. Eels. The catalysts are brutal and simple: a debt of $3 million and a proposal born of desperation. A contract marriage. Her to a 70-year-old titan of organized crime for the singular purpose of bearing his child. Eels. Her defiance is a fragile shield, a posture suggesting she might break before she bends, a dangerous trait in a gilded cage like this. She sits in a chair worth more than she is, a rigid figure in a sea of opulent silence. Eels. At 23, she has learned to use her own spine as an anchor against the wreckage of her life. Across an expanse of polished mahogany, Victor Castelli wields silence as a weapon. Eels. 4 minutes of it, a duration she tracks with the frantic beat of her own heart, designed to unmake her. The 70 years he carries don't hang on him like a shroud. They are carved into him, the product of a lifetime of disciplined cruelties. Eels. He is immovable. When he finally speaks, his voice is flat, a dead thing in the quiet room, delivering the blow without inflection. Your mother owes my organization $3.2 million. Lena doesn't even flinch. Eels. She already knew the number. She had lived with the weight of it, a ghost haunting her every breath, born from a mother's pathological need to gamble away their world. I'm aware, she says, her voice a clipped, steady thing. Victor's eyes, Eels, pale and devoid of color, settle on her, the gaze of a predator assessing its prey. He spells out the impossibility of repayment, laying the facts down like headstones. Her reply is what changes the room, what shifts the axis of her fate. Not in cash, Eels. A flicker of something, amusement perhaps, cracks the marble of his expression for a fraction of a second. Eels. Now Castelli moves to dismantle her piece by piece. He recites the bleak poetry of her finances: $42,000 a year, $1,700 in savings, $12,000 in student debt. It is a classic maneuver, Eels, reducing a human being to a ledger of failures to assert total control. Her jaw tightens, a visible tremor of impact, but she parries the dehumanization with cold logic. And yet, you agreed to meet with me, Eels. Victor allows the point before revealing the hook: her mother's desperate begging, and more critically, his own urgent problem which requires a very specific solution. Eels. He pushes a file across the desk. Inside, photographs chronicle a life lived without joy. Victor at a funeral, at a board meeting, at a wedding. The background changes, but the cold emptiness in his eyes never does. Then comes the heart of it. His father, Eels, the true patriarch of the Castelli Empire, is dying. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. He has 6 months, maybe less. Victor delivers the news with the same detachment he might use to report the weather. Eels. His father's death just another variable in a brutal equation. Succession, he explains, comes with a condition, one both archaic and utterly ruthless. Eels. The old man's decree is a thing of mythic cruelty. Leadership passes to the first of his children to produce a legitimate heir, a race. Victor against his 3 married siblings, one of whose wife is already blooming with child. Eels. The gears turn in Lena's mind with chilling speed and precision. You need a wife, she states, tasting like ash. Correction is surgical, stripping away any last vestige of romance. I need an heir, Eels. When she dares to ask what happens if she says no, he paints a picture of absolute annihilation, a future so bleak it makes his proposal seem like salvation. Eels. When she asks what saying yes would mean, he lays out the contract for her life. She will marry him, live in his house, perform the duties of a wife, and until a healthy child is conceived and delivered. Then, and only then, her mother's debt vanishes. Eels. She receives $5 million, a clean divorce, and her freedom. Freedom. Her mind zeroes in on her mother, safe and unburdened. A year of her life, perhaps less, in exchange for that. Her eyes drift back to the photos, Eels, to the smiling woman in the wedding dress. She asks about his last wife. I've never been married, he says. The woman in the picture, he clarifies, was just another business arrangement. Eels. The smile Lena offered was all performance. Victor's hands lay flat on the desk as he delivers his terms. She has 48 hours. The wedding would be in 3 days. A contract, ironclad, would detail every moment of their shared existence. Feels. Lena's throat constricts. I have conditions. A single eyebrow. Victor's only concession to surprise arches upward. You're not in a position to negotiate. Then you're not desperate enough. She holds his gaze, betting everything on her read of him. Feels. You could marry anyone, but you're here with me because everyone who matters knows this is a transaction, not a romance. Feels. They'd expect a prenup. I'm nobody. She speaks her greatest asset aloud, her complete and utter disposability. She is the perfect, uncomplicated vessel for his ambition. Then she lays down her terms. Feels. Her voice a wire pulled taut against the fear vibrating through her. My mother goes to the best rehab facility in the state. You pay for it. She then demands a safe, untouchable place for her mother to live after. Feels. He agrees without a flicker of hesitation. I want my own bank account, enough to live on. He offers her access. She refuses. Feels. Lena rejects his offer of mere access, demanding a fully autonomous account, her name only, with $10,000 deposited every month. She needed something that was hers. A hint of resistance plays across Victor's features before he gives one sharp, feels, definitive nod. Her final condition: when I give you your heir, I disappear. No contact, you let me go. He confirms if it was always the design. I need to hear you say it. In response, Victor leans forward, his posture an invasion of her space. Feels, his eyes locking onto hers. When you fulfill your obligations, Lena Park, you will be free. I will not look for you. I will not follow you. Feels. You will leave my life as completely as you entered it. You have my word. The word of a monster backed by an empire of violence. Lena rises to her feet, her movement stiff, but her voice holds. I'll have an answer in 48 hours. Feels. You already know your answer, he counters, his voice low. He's right. The choice was made before she ever walked through the door. I need time to think. You need time to lie to yourself. Victor also stands. Feels. His presence seeming to shrink the very room around them. He sees her desperate need for the illusion of choice, this brief moment to mourn her own life, and grants the meaningless request. Feels. Lena's fingernails dig crescent moons into her palms, a small secret pain to anchor her. You're a real bastard, you know that. His agreement is instantaneous, without shame. Yes. Victor closes the space between them, his nearness a tactical move. Feels. An assertion of raw physical power. He was taller than she'd thought, broader, a man built to be a weapon. But I'm an honest one, he says, twisting his pathology into a point of pride. This is a transaction. You give me an heir, I give you freedom. Feels. Everything else is theater. Her chin lifts, a last flare of defiance. Good, because I don't love you either. Then we understand each other, perfectly. He holds out a card. Feels. My personal number. Call when you've made your decision. Lena takes it, and for a half second their fingers brush. His skin is warm, a shocking human detail. She has one last question, a point of clarification on the performance to come. Feels. Victor's face shifts into something far darker than a smile. It means you'll play the part of a devoted wife, convince the world this is real. My enemies will be looking for a weakness. You will give them none. And in private? She asks. Feels, her voice barely a whisper. In private, you're free to hate me as much as you want. Feels. Lena slips the card into her pocket and turns for the door. Just as her hand finds the cold brass knob, Victor says her name. She looks back. If you say yes, he says, his voice dropping to a near growl, there's no turning back. Feels. No running. Once you're mine until the contract is fulfilled. Do you understand? She can feel her pulse, hammering against the thin skin of her throat. I understand. Good. She steps out into a sterile corridor of marble and cold. Feels. Calculating light. 2 guards flank the elevator, silent sentinels of her new prison. She steps inside, and as the doors slide shut, she feels the lock turn on her life. Feels. The break, when it came, happened in the silence. Not in the heat of the threat, but in the hollow, echoing aftermath, when the adrenaline bled out and left nothing but a cold tremor behind. Feels. It took 47 hours for the shock to recede enough for Lena to make the call. Victor answered on the first ring, as if he'd been waiting, his hand on the receiver. His question came stripped of all warmth, a blade in the dark. Yes or no? Feels. It was a surgeon's cut, designed to sever possibility, to leave no room for the chaos of a human heart. Her life had already been painted in shades of gray, a world leached of color, which made her a willing subject for his dark masterpiece. Feels. Her yes was the trigger. Victor's terms were absolute, a command meant to unmake her, bring nothing. A final, desperate plea to see her mother, to hold on to one last thread of the world she knew, was met with cold denial. It was a calculated severing. Heels. Her mother's care wasn't a gift, but a prize. Heels. A thing to be earned, tying Lena's obedience directly to the life of the one person she loved. Heels. And with that, the hook was set. Lena's cry of rage was met with the dead silence of a disconnected line. The click of a closing cage. The phone met the wall in a blast of plastic and fury, a useless gesture against an invisible enemy. Heels. She pressed her forehead to the cold window pane, the shock of it a desperate anchor in the storm tearing her apart. She had just sold herself to a man 30 years older than her own mother. Heels. A phantom who lived by a code of violence and shadow that defied everything she knew of the world. There was no going back. The car, a black Mercedes with windows like polished obsidian, was a hearse for her old life. Heels. Arriving with the chilling precision of exactly 9 o'clock. Heels. Lena stood waiting, wearing the best dress she owned. A fragile piece of armor. A last attempt to claim some dignity in a moment that had stripped her of all of it. The driver remained silent, his presence reinforcing the cold, heels, transactional horror of the morning. Inside, the air was thick, with the scent of new leather and expensive cologne, the smell of a world she was being forced into, a world she would never belong to. Victor didn't look at her. He made her wait, heels, a tactic designed to shrink her, to render her insignificant in the vast, silent space of the car. The chasm between them was physical, psychological. 10 minutes stretched into an eternity, a deliberate test of her will. Heels. Her attempt to break the silence was a small act of rebellion, sarcasm a tiny spark in the suffocating darkness. Are you always this chatty? His only response was a slow, dismissive turn of his head. Heels. When she asked where they were going, his answer was a single, sterile phrase. City Hall. He was framing their union as a piece of paperwork, a transaction. This isn't a celebration, Lena. It's a legal formality. Heels. The words were meant to poison any lingering hope of sentiment, to cement his power over the narrative. He produced a contract, a 40-page document bound in leather, its dense legal text a form of visual intimidation. Heels. It was a labyrinth of words meant to overwhelm and confuse her. The first clauses that swam into focus were about her body, her freedom. This says I can't leave the property without your permission. His confirmation was a hammer blow. Correct. Heels. The sentence was for 1 year, or until she carried his child. Heels. It's house arrest, Lena breathed, the words tasting like ash. Victor corrected her, his voice devoid of emotion. It's protecting my investment. He had reduced her to an object, a thing to be guarded. Then came the shadows, Heels, the faceless enemies he conjured to justify her isolation, to make her dependent on her captor. Her question, what if she refused to sign, was met with a chillingly calm reminder of the consequences, the unspoken threat to her mother hanging between them. Heels. Then the contract specified their room, a shared bedroom. Appearances matter, Victor stated, the core of his obsession laid bare, a need for the perfect facade. He had promised not to touch her, but her space, her proximity, that was his to command. Heels. Separate rooms would breed gossip among the staff, he explained with cold logic, gossip his siblings could use as a weapon. Heels. His argument was a perfect, intricate trap, built of flawless reason, designed to hide its true purpose, total ownership of her. Whether or not anything happens there is irrelevant. A hot flush of shame and fury crept up Lena's neck. Heels. The final page laid out the transaction in brutal, simple terms. $5 million, her mother's debt gone, a clean break, all of it contingent on the birth of a child. It was the price for her body, for her womb. She asked for a pen. Heels. His final act of control was to deny her even that. You'll sign after the ceremony. The car stopped. Before them, City Hall stood like a cold gray monument to the death of feeling, the perfect altar for their exchange. Heels. Through the window, Lena saw other couples bathed in laughter and light, and the contrast was a physical pain, a spotlight on the grotesquerie of her own situation. Victor offered his hand. Heels. A perfectly rehearsed gesture from a life of tradition she was now parodying. She took it, her hesitation a final, silent surrender. His grip was firm, steady, and inescapable. The grip of a man who would never let go. Heels. The ceremony itself was a 12-minute blur, the words spoken by a clerk whose eyes were already looking past them. Victor's vows were delivered with the cold precision of a business deal. Lena's "I do" was a shattered whisper. Heels. A tremor in her voice that betrayed the war raging inside her. Heels. There were no cheers, no stolen kiss, just the clerk's flat voice. Congratulations. Next. The finality was a brutal slamming door. She was Lena Castell now, a name that felt like a costume. The estate, an hour's drive from the city, Heils, rose from the countryside like a fortress, built for isolation and defense. They passed through 3 security checkpoints, each one a psychological blow, impressing upon her the absolute finality of her imprisonment. Heils. She saw the main building not as a home but as a keep of stone and glass, a perfect assessment of its role in Victor's world. The driver opened her door one last time before delivering her to her new life. Heils. The air here felt different, thin and still, another sensory sign that she had left her own world far behind. Victor led her into a foyer of marble and shadow, a space built to dominate the senses. From the silence, a woman appeared. Mrs. Kozlov, Heils. Her posture severe, her voice as crisp and starched as her uniform. She was the enforcer of this cold kingdom. Victor's instructions were clipped. He called Lena my wife, Heils. But the words were immediately followed by orders that handed her over like a package to be processed. I don't have things, Lena said, a faint final protest against the complete erasure of who she was. Heils. Then see that she has things, Victor commanded, his power absolute, creating her new reality from thin air. He gave one final instruction. Dinner is at 7. Don't be late. And then he was gone. He left her standing there, adrift and disoriented, forcing her to depend on the mercy of his staff. Mrs. Kozlov's voice cut through her shock, using the new name like a brand. This way, Mrs. Castell. The path to her room was a winding, deliberate maze, designed to make her feel utterly lost. Heils. Mrs. Kozlov stopped before the master bedroom. The room was immense, a cavern of monochrome grays and blacks that seemed to absorb all light and warmth, a perfect mirror of its owner. It was a space of cold, perfect elegance. Heils. Mrs. Kozlov pointed out the layout. The connected dressing rooms, the shared bathroom, a geography of forced intimacy. She informed Lena that clothing would be brought, completing the final act of stripping away her past. Heils. When Lena asked whose room it was, the answer was blunt. His room. And now hers, theirs. Mrs. Kozlov's face remained a perfect, unreadable mask, a quality Victor had surely selected her for. Heils. Lena's acceptance was a sound so faint it was almost lost in the room's oppressive silence. Resignation. The final instructions for dinner were issued. Then Mrs. Kozlov offered something she called advice. But it was a threat, a map of the new rules, punctuality and discretion, a warning against questions and defiance. The door clicked shut, leaving Lena utterly alone, a prisoner finally forced to see the bars of her psychological cage. Heils. The clothing arrived on silent feet, a river of silk and cashmere, delivered with the impersonal efficiency of a state institution. The sheer volume of it was an assault, a mountain of wealth meant to overwhelm her, to bind her in gratitude. Designer names she had only ever seen in magazines, a uniform for a life she didn't want. Her hand, moving as if in a dream, selected a black silk dress, the fabric cool against her skin, a beautiful shroud for the woman she used to be. Heils. She caught her reflection and for a terrifying moment saw a stranger. Just 2 days ago, she was an accountant in Queens. Now she was this, a woman draped in impossible luxury, the property of a man she truly feared. Through the vast window, Heils, the garden below was perfect, each flower and hedge sculpted into submission, a prison made of beauty. It was a perfect metaphor for her life now. She pressed her head against the cold glass, a familiar grounding pain. At 5 minutes to 7, Heils, a sharp knock echoed on the door. It was time. Lena had followed the silent order, dressed herself in her new skin, barely recognizing the captive her reflection had become. Heils. Lena Castelli pulls open the heavy door, and the man standing there is a creature of shadow, his suit a void against the light. She begins to refuse his presence. I can find it myself. But his reply cuts through her protest, a statement of absolute law. Heils. Mr. Castelli insists. In that moment, the hierarchy is forged. She follows, a silent captive led through a winding maze of hallways designed to erase any sense of direction. They arrive at the dining room. It is a chamber of stark, echoing silence. Heils. Crafted to diminish the soul. At the far end of a long, polished table, a king on his throne, sits Victor Castelli. He doesn't look up, his attention fixed to the glow of a small screen, his indifference a display of absolute power. Heils. Lena retreats to the opposite end, placing the vast empty space between them like a shield. Heils. The silence that follows is a physical weight, a battle fought in the space between heartbeats. It is Lena who breaks first, her voice a small thing in the cavernous room, the silence having become a torment. Heils. Victor's response is a masterpiece of cruelty, a slow turning of the screw. If you prefer conversation, you're welcome to initiate it. He forces the burden of connection entirely onto her. Her questions are met with single heels, dismissive words, productive, until he decides to unleash his weapon. You're an employee. The words are not spoken. They are detonated, a psychological blast meant to redefine her, to strip her of worth. Her hands clench into white-knuckled fists. Heels. A server enters then, a perfectly timed interruption, a stagehand appearing to reset the scene, and the moment dissolves, the conflict expertly diffused. Heels. They eat in a silence punctuated only by the faint click of silver on porcelain. The food is exquisite, tasteless, a prop in this theater of control. Lena makes her move, a predictable grasp for some small power. I want to see my mother. Heels. Victor's denial is swift and final. Not yet. She presses, trying to test the truth of the world he has built around her. His answer is a demonstration of his omniscience. Heels. He recites her mother's location, Green Hill Recovery Center, down to the exact room number, the precise time of her admission. This isn't reassurance. It is a chilling display of his reach, a reminder that he is a god in this universe and she is utterly, feels hopelessly dependent on him. Feels. He offers proof, the admission records, another casual flex of his absolute power. Her silence is his victory. I don't lie, he says, the chilling pronouncement of a man who believes his truth is the only one that exists. He denies her a visit, heals, twisting the cruelty into an act of salvation. The moment you leave this property, you become a target. He weaves a tale of imminent danger, casting himself as her sole protector, the architect of her gilded cage. Heals. Her cry, I hate you, is the sound of a soul breaking. He welcomes it. Good. Her pain is proof of his control. And then, the final twist of the knife, a whisper that sounds almost like empathy. So do I. Feels. Victor rises and is gone, terminating the scene on his own terms. Lena is left alone in the cold, sterile room, the emotional surgery complete. For the first time she weeps, not silent tears, but racking sobs that shake her frame. Feels. The first stage of her resistance is over. The week that follows is a montage of structured emptiness. He is a ghost. Their dinners are silent rituals, the words spoken between them rarely numbering more than 10. In the bed they are forced to share, feels. A barrier of pillows rises between them, a desperate, heartbreaking demarcation of territory. Feels. To cope, Lena begins to explore, charting the geography of her prison. She memorizes the library, paces the gym, and runs her hands over the locked doors that mark the edges of her world. In a desperate act, she calls the rehabilitation center, Heals, a faint hope for a voice from the outside. But Victor's control is absolute. Patient confidentiality becomes another bar in her cell. The administrator's polite refusal is the final confirmation of her powerlessness. Feels. The pressure builds until the 8th day. He returns late, a shadow in the doorway, and finds her waiting for him in the dark. Feels. I can't do this, she whispers, the words unraveling. She speaks of feeling herself disappearing, of the air growing too thick to breathe. His reply is a cold splash of water, a denial of her reality. You're adjusting, he says. You're being dramatic. Feels. And with that, something inside her ignites. The despair hardens into rage. I'm a person, Victor, not a broodmare. The final word hangs in the air, charged and dangerous. It strikes a nerve. He moves toward her then, a swift, heels. Predatory advance that erases the space between them, his physical presence, an overwhelming act of dominance. Heels. He offers honesty, but honesty from him is just another instrument of control. He confirms it all. She is here to provide an heir, but he reframes the narrative with chilling artistry. It isn't a prison, it is a sanctuary. Heels. I didn't lock you in this house to break you. I locked you in to keep you alive. The monster recasts himself as the savior. Her voice cracks as she asks why, a fissure appearing in her defenses, a sign that she is ready to believe. Sit down, Heels, he commands. A test. She obeys. He moves to the window, a silhouette against the fading light, setting the stage for his revelation. Heels. Victor paints a portrait of his family in shades of blood and chaos. Marco, the reckless fool. Dominic, a walking scandal. His wife, a specter of desperation. Elena, brilliant and pathologically cruel. Heels. He constructs the narrative to leave only one possible conclusion. He is the only one fit to rule. He turns from the window, his face half in shadow. All three of them will do whatever it takes. Do you understand what that means? Feels. He leads her down the path. A knot of ice forms in her stomach. They'd hurt me. He lets the word hang, then replaces it with something far worse. They'd kill you. The air in the room turns to frost. The marriage, he says, is not about love. Feels. It's about succession. Feels. This is a war, he says, a battle for his father's empire. His siblings are not merely rivals. They are a fool, a sadist, and a viper. And you are? She challenges, a flicker of her old fire. A bitter, self-aware smile touches his lips. No, feels. But I'm the only option that doesn't end in blood. A messiah crowned in thorns of his own making. When she asks why he chose her, an outsider, his analysis is clinical brutal. You're clean, uncomplicated. And most importantly, feels, you're desperate enough to agree. He looks at her as if she is a finely calibrated instrument, chosen for its simplicity. Feels. He crouches before her, an illusion of intimacy. Monodic, disarming confession that reveals nothing. And then comes the promise, the core of the gilded cage. As long as you're my wife, no one will touch you. Safety, but only within these walls. Her freedom, they are conditional prizes, held in escrow until a child is born. The target on her back is real, he insists. But her purpose, her utility, has an expiration date. Feels. What if I can't get pregnant? The question is a surrender, an acceptance of his horrifying terms. Then we both lose, he says, binding their fates together in a knot of potential failure. The next morning he is gone, but a note remains. Not an apology, feels. A command, an assignment to read poetry, specifically poems of entrapment. It is a breathtakingly cruel manipulation. To manage her despair by prescribing the very language of her suffering, she obeys, feels. She spends the day breathing the words of long-dead poets who knew what it was to be caged. Feels. The poetry works. Not as a cure, but as an anesthetic. The library becomes her sanctuary, a place where she can sublimate her terror into study. She traces the words of writers who knew the shape of a cage, finding a strange companionship in their pain. Feels. 3 weeks pass. The open warfare between them recedes, replaced by a kind of quiet, functional despair, a silent truce. Did you find the collection? He asks one evening. Yes, she says, and the single word carries the weight of everything. Feels. He has given her a lexicon for her own captivity, and the conditioning has taken root. Feels. This became her world. The staff moved around her with the careful deference one affords a priceless, fragile vase. A woman named Mrs. Kozlov delivered a daily schedule with the rigidity of a prison warden. Breakfast at 0800, feels. Lunch at 1200, dinner at 1900. Gardeners outside worked with their eyes fixed to the earth. Security guards moved in silent, overlapping orbits, a constant, voiceless presence. Lena felt like an exhibit in a museum of one. Then, feels. On the 23rd day, the pattern broke. She woke, and he was still there. She froze, a deer caught in an unexpected light. He lay on his side, his breathing slow and even. He had always been gone before sunrise, a creature of the dark, feels. Seeing him in the morning light, asleep, was a violation of the established order, feels. To watch him in that unguarded state felt like a transgression. She slipped from the bed with the silence of a phantom, gathering clothes, moving toward the bathroom. His voice stopped her cold. It's Saturday. Lena halted, her back to him, feels. Victor's eyes were open, watching her. What? Saturday, he said again. I don't work Saturdays. Oh, she clutched the clothes to her chest, a shield of fabric. I didn't know. Now you do. He sat up, the sheet pooling at his waist, feels, and ran a hand through his dark hair. It was the most human she had ever seen him, a calculated glimpse of the man beneath the monster. Mrs. Kozlov is off on weekends. Kitchen staff will leave breakfast in the warmers. Help yourself. You're not eating? Feels. I'll eat later. He had dismissed her, but his presence was an anchor, holding her there in the silent, hesitant dawn. Feels. Should I leave? She breathed, the words barely disturbing the air. I can go to the library, or this is your room too, Lena, he cut in. You don't need my permission to exist. The words meant perhaps as a kindness, feels. Instead felt like a bolt locking a cage door, a stark reminder of her place. A small, tight nod was her only reply before she vanished into the bathroom. When she emerged 20 minutes later, the steam clinging to her skin, the room was empty, feels. She found him in the gymnasium, a place she'd avoided, its mirrored walls and cavernous echo a constant source of unease. Yet the sound, the rhythmic, brutal thud of fist against leather, pulled her to the threshold. He stood before the heavy bag, shirtless, feels, only a pair of black athletic trousers clinging to his frame, feels. His back was turned to her, a landscape of violence written in scar tissue, a story etched across his skin. Some marks were ghosts, faded with time. Others were fresh, angry keloids of raised, pink flesh. He worked the bag with a chilling, mechanical rhythm, feels. Left, right, no wasted energy, no hesitation. Lena knew she should retreat, that she was trespassing and violent, but her eyes were fixed on the map of his history. You can come in, Victor said, feels. His voice cutting through the percussive beat without him ever turning. Or you can stand there, but stop hovering. Heat flared up her neck, a telltale blush of being caught. She stepped inside. I wasn't hovering. You were. 3 more brutal impacts, heels, and then he stopped, turning to face her. His chest was the same story, a mosaic of old wounds. See something you like? I didn't mean to stare. Heels. They all do, the first time. Victor grabbed a towel from a bench, swiping it across his face. 2 bullets, piece of shrapnel from a car bomb in Prague. He listed like groceries. Occupational hazards, heels. The clinical detachment he used to narrate his own mutilation was terrifying. Lena swallowed hard against a sudden tightness in her throat. Does it hurt? Not anymore. Did it? Then, Victor's eyes locked onto hers, heels, and in their depths was a darkness that had nothing to do with the gym's poor lighting. Yes, the word was a stone dropped into a deep well, heavy with a pain that went far beyond the physical. Lena's gaze broke first. I should go. Why? Heels. I'm bothering you. You're not. He tossed the towel aside, moving toward a weight bench. You've been here nearly a month. You only leave this room for meals or the library. That kind of isolation, it's not good for anyone's stability. Heels. I didn't know you were tracking my health. I track functionality. Heels. A woman who is depressed and isolated doesn't conceive. It's simple biology. And there it was. Hard truth of the contract, the singular reason for her gilded cage. A muscle jumped in Lena's jaw. Right. Can't have the merchandise getting damaged. Heels. Victor paused, his hand hovering over a dumbbell, and slowly straightened. That isn't what I meant. Isn't it? No. He crossed the floor until he was just feet away, his presence a physical force. Intimidation. Heels. She could smell the soap and sweat on his skin. You want to hate me, Lena? Fine, hate me. But don't write my motives for me. I am practical, not cruel. Is there a difference? Yes. Then explain it to me. He studied her face then. Heels. His eyes narrowed in analysis as if she were a complex equation he was determined to solve. Heels. Cruelty is enjoying the pain of others, violence for its own sake. I don't enjoy this, he motioned around them. At the house, at her, at everything. Any of it. I do what is necessary. Heels. And what's necessary now is making sure you don't break down inside this place. And this is, what? An act of charity? It's common sense. A sharp, broken sound escaped Lena's lips. Not a laugh, but the noise of something splintering. Heels. You lock me in a mansion, cut me off from my entire life, and constantly remind me I'm here for one purpose, and now you're worried about my mental health? That's rich. Would you rather I pretend to have feelings that aren't in our agreement? Heels. I'd rather you be honest. You have my honesty. Victor's voice never wavered, a perfectly controlled instrument of psychological pressure. Heels. I don't love you. I won't. But I will not let you wither away in here either. So if you need to work out, work out. If you need to scream, scream. If you need to break something, I'll find you something to break. Heels. But stop hiding in that library, pretending you're fine. Her throat felt tight. Why do you care? Because a woman with dead eyes is of no use to me, of course. It always came back to the goal. The contract. She turned to leave. Lena. She froze. Heels, her back to him. There's a pool, Victor said. Through the east terrace. It's heated. Private. No one will bother you. Why are you telling me this? Heels. Because I imagine you need a space that isn't filled with books and furniture. Things that only remind you that you are trapped. Heels. Lena finally risked a look over her shoulder. Victor watched her, his expression a mask. It wasn't pity, not sympathy. It was something closer to recognition, as if he knew, intimately, the crushing weight of a cage. Thank you, she whispered. Heels. He gave a sharp nod and turned back to his weights. Lena left before the moment could curdle into something else. The pool was exactly as he'd said, warm, silent, walled in by stone and sleeping ivy. The water was a sheet of glass, reflecting the blank, Heels. Gray sky. Fully dressed, Lena sat on the cold coping and slid her feet in. She didn't own a swimsuit, but just feeling the open air on her skin, air that hadn't been filtered through glass, felt like the first real breath she'd taken in weeks. Heels. She stayed until the sun bled from the sky, until the cold seeped into her bones and her feet were numb. When she returned to the house, a box sat on her bed. Inside, 3 swimsuits, all in different styles, all in her size. No note. Heels. The gesture left her suspended between gratitude and the chilling paranoia of being watched, always. The next move in their silent war came the following Saturday. At breakfast, in a smaller dining room, as Lena tore a croissant into pieces, Heels, Victor looked up from his financial paper. Do you play chess? He asked, the question so unexpected it made her flinch. What? Chess? Do you play? I know the moves. I'm not very good. That's enough. Heels. Victor folded the paper with surgical precision. Library, 1 hour. Why? Because this silence is tedious, and you are radiating a boredom so profound it's becoming a fire hazard. Lena could only stare. You want to play chess with me? Feels. Do you have a better offer? She didn't. An hour later, they sat across an antique marble board near the library's tall windows. Victor opened. Pawn to e4, she mirrored him. Pawn to e5. They played in a heavy silence. Feels. The only sound the soft click of marble on marble. His style was what you'd expect, brutal, efficient, methodical. Hers was pure defense, a desperate attempt to stave off the inevitable. He had her in checkmate in 18 moves. Feels. Again, he commanded, already resetting the pieces. I told you, I'm not good at this. You're better than you think. You panic. He lined up his soldiers. Stop thinking 5 moves ahead. Think 2. Control the center. Feels. And protect your queen until you have no choice but to sacrifice her. That's a dark way to play. It's a practical way. The second game began. This time she lasted 23 moves. Better, was all Victor said. I still lost. Everyone loses at first. Feels. The question is if you learn from it. Lena stared at the board, at her captured pieces lying on the side like casualties. Is this a lesson? It's a game of chess. It can be a metaphor. For the briefest second, the corner of his mouth twitched. Feels, a ghost of a smile. Feels. If you need it to be. A third game started. She tried a strategy, control the center, guard the queen, think only 2 steps forward. She lost again, but this time it took him 30 moves. You're learning, Victor said. I'm losing slower. Same thing. Feels. Lena leaned back in her chair. Why are you doing this? No, being less of an asshole. He paused, considering. Because you were right. You're not livestock, and treating you that way is counterproductive. So this is strategy? Feels. Everything is strategy, Lena. The only question is whether or not the strategy recognizes your humanity. She had absolutely no answer for that. Feels. Victor stood, beginning to put the marble pieces away. Same time next week? My schedule is wide open. Good. He left her there. Lena stayed behind, staring at the empty board, wondering what game they were really playing. Feels. The chess matches became an anchor in her week. Every Saturday. 1 hour that often bled into 2. Slowly, she began to win. Rarely, but it happened. It was enough that he stopped giving her advice and started to genuinely focus. You sacrificed your bishop, Feels. He noted in their 7th game. I had to open the lane for my rook. It's a risk, a calculated one. Victor looked up from the board then, and for a fleeting, impossible moment she saw something like pride in his eyes. Check, Feels. Lena slid her king across the board. It was a beautiful, useless move. It's not over, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Not yet. 3 moves later, her king stood alone, a condemned man waiting for the axe. Almost, Victor said. Feels. His voice a low hum that vibrated through the table. Almost is nothing. Almost, he countered, is where you discover the line between being brave and being a fool. A laugh escaped her then, a startled, fragile sound that broke the room's heavy silence. Feels. A fissure in the dam of her control. Did you really just make a chess game a lesson on my character? You're the one who called it a metaphor. I was being ironic. Irony is a language the desperate can't afford. He swept the pieces from the board. Feels. The clatter of ivory on wood, an echo of a closing cell door. Again, don't you have a corporation to run? It can wait. Feels. The ritual continued, a slow grinding away of her defiance, until the afternoon light bled from the sky and the arrival of Mrs. Kozlov shattered the trance. She realized with a sudden chill that she hadn't thought of the contract even once. Feels. That profound lack of fear should have been a screaming siren in her soul. Instead, there was only silence. On the 43rd day, the silence broke. Lena was pulled from sleep by sounds from the hall, voices like splintering bone, sharp and lethal. Feels. The world tilted. Victor's side of the bed was cold, the sheets a stark white shroud in the 4:30 a.m. gloom. She pulled on a rope, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, and cracked open the door. Victor was there, already a specter in a dark suit. Feels. Flanked by 2 other shadows. His voice was a low growl, leashed and deadly. How many? 3 cars. Hit the north gate. Drop 2 of our men, but they'll live. They vanished the second our response team showed. No plates, no faces. Ghosts. Feels. Victor's jaw locked, a tectonic shift stress under his skin. Marco or Dominic? No way to know. But the timing. Marco's wife is 32 weeks pregnant. Feels. The implication hung in the air, thick as blood. A man with a deadline is a desperate animal. Double the patrols on the perimeter. Lock it down. Nothing gets in or out unless I say so. And bring me every frame of that security footage. Victor turned then, Feels, and his eyes found her in the sliver of light from the doorway. His face was a mask of calm, but his whole body went rigid, A flicker of violence he couldn't hide, inside now. The order was a blade. Lena retreated. He followed. Heels. The lock on the door clicking shut with the finality of a coffin lid. "What is happening?" she asked the man who was suddenly a stranger. "It's nothing for you to worry about. Someone attacked us." "Someone tested our walls," he corrected. Heels. His words meant to shrink the terror. "There's a difference." "Then Victor, get into something you can fight in." His instructions came like bullets, rapid and cold. "Stay here. Lock this door. You don't open it. Not for anyone but me or Mrs. Kozlov." Heels. The fear she hadn't felt before arrived all at once, a cold flood in her veins. Heels. "You're terrifying me. Good. Fear will keep you alive." He was reframing the terror, twisting it into a tool, a weapon she was meant to wield. From a closet, Victor produced a small black case. He opened it. Inside, nestled in foam, was a gun. Heels. "Do you know how this works?" Lena could only stare at the object, a piece of sculpted death that made the room feel unreal. "No, the safety is here. You point and you squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. And you don't think." Heels. "If someone who isn't me comes through that door, you use it." He placed the gun in her hands. It was so cold, so heavy, an anchor pulling her down into this new and terrible reality. "Lena, look at me." Her eyes lifted to his. "If it happens," Victor said. Heels. His voice dropping to a whisper. "If they get to you, there's no talking, there's no bargaining. You shoot. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "This is insane." "Do you understand?" he demanded, his will pressing down on her. "Yes." Heels. "Say it." "I shoot. I don't negotiate." The words were a vow, a dark baptism into his world. "Good." Victor grabbed his phone, already turning for the door. "I will be back. 3 hours, maybe less. Keep this door locked." And then he was gone. Heels. She was alone with the gun and the suffocating silence. She locked the door, changed into jeans, and sat on the edge of the bed, a sentinel in her own prison. Time stretched and warped, each minute a lifetime. Heels. Every sound the old house made, a floorboard creaking, the wind sighing against the glass, a distant latch, was a gunshot in the dark. Heels. She kept the safety on. A small rational rebellion in the heart of madness. 1 hour bled into the next, then 2. Right at the 3-hour mark, a knock. Lena's heart seized in her chest. "Who's there?" "Victor." She moved to the door. Heels. Her hands shaking so badly she could barely stand. "How do I know it's really you?" A beat of silence, and then came the code, their own private liturgy. "The first time we had dinner, you told me you hated me." "I said it was a good thing." Heels. "You said you meant it." "And I said so did I." A password born from the ashes of their first battle. She fumbled with the lock and opened the door. It was him, his suit unrumpled, but his eyes were different. They were arctic, honed to a razor's edge. Heels. "Are you all right?" she breathed. "I'm fine." He stepped inside, locked the door behind him, and his gaze fell to the gun still in her hand. Heels. "Did you have to use it?" "No." "Good." He took the weapon from her, his movements fluid and sure, and returned it to its case. "The perimeter is clean. It was just a probe. They wanted to see our response." "Who are they?" "Does it matter who?" "Yes." Heels. For the first time since she'd known him, Victor sat down as if the weight of his own body was too much. It was a perfect performance of vulnerability. "Marco?" she asked softly. "Probably. He's getting desperate. His wife is due in 8 weeks. Heels. He's out of time." Lena found herself sitting beside him, closing the space between them. "What happens if the baby is born before you fix this?" "He wins." "I lose," Victor said, his voice flat. "And you become a liability." The word was a scalpel. Heels, precise and cold, meant to cut her open. "A liability," she repeated, the word tasting like ash. Heels. "You are my wife. You could carry my son. If Marco takes over, he has to erase any other claim. That means you, and it means any child of mine." Lena felt the blood drain from her face. The reaction was primal. "He would kill me. He would try." Heels. "And what would you do? Just let him?" Victor's head snapped toward her, his eyes blazing. "No, then what?" "Then I would kill him first." He said it with no more emotion than if he were ordering dinner. It was the absolute chilling truth. This is not a game. Heels. This isn't chess. This is about blood and inheritance and power. So yes, if it is him or you, I choose you. Not from love, but because you belong to me, and I destroy anything that touches what is mine. Heels. That brutal declaration of ownership, a thing that should have sent her screaming, landed instead like a moment of profound, terrifying honesty. It was the clearest sign yet that the bars of her cage were beginning to feel like an embrace. Heels. "I don't know if I can live like this." "You have no choice. There's always a choice. Not in my world." Victor stood, shattering the moment. "Get some rest. We're going to a dinner tomorrow night." The sudden shift was like being thrown into ice water. Heels. "What?" A dinner. My father is hosting. Family only. Your attendance is required. You told me I couldn't leave the estate. This is not leaving. This is walking into the lion's den and making them believe you are the lioness. As he spoke, Victor pulled off his shirt, a casual act of raw dominance. Wear something memorable. Smile. Take my hand. Be the loving wife. And for the love of, don't let them smell your fear. I'm not afraid. He saw right through her. Yes, you are. You're smart to be. But tomorrow, fear is a luxury you cannot afford. Tomorrow, you are Mrs. Victor Castell. You are untouchable, adored, and madly in love. A bitter, fleeting twist of his lips prayed something. Disgust, maybe. Think you can act the part? Lena's pulse hammered against her throat. Do I have a choice? No. Then I'll act. His eyes held hers, a final silent assertion of his absolute power over her. Then he turned and walked into the shadows, leaving her trembling as she began to rehearse for a role that could cost her life. The costume arrived the next afternoon. Lena lifted it from the tissue paper, an emerald green silk dress, designed to be seen to be remembered. A note from Victor was pinned to the strap. Green makes you look dangerous. Wear the diamonds. V. The order was absolute. She was not an accessory tonight. She was a weapon. The diamonds were merely ammunition. Mrs. Kozlov worked in silence, her hands deft and impersonal, sculpting Lena into the creature Victor required. You will pass, was her only comment. At 6, Victor appeared in the doorway, a vision of death in a perfectly tailored black suit. He was the very definition of violence dressed in wealth. His eyes swept over her once, a swift, possessive inspection. Good, was that all? Good? A part of her wanted to scream, would you prefer I lie and say you look beautiful? The silent answer was just as sharp. I'd prefer you act like a human. Victor's mouth twitched, a barely perceptible flicker. You look beautiful. The dress, the diamonds. They are perfect on you. Better? Hardly. Then we are a matched set. He held out his arm. Ready? No, yes. The war inside her was silent and bloody. They descended the stairs to the waiting car. The moment the doors shut, the small space crackled with a tension that was almost unbearable. The rules, Victor said as the estate gate slid silently behind them. I'm listening. You don't speak unless spoken to. You do not leave my side. You do not engage with my brothers or their wives. And under no circumstances do you take food or a drink from anyone but a server. This final command revealed the depth of the poison in his world. You actually think they would poison me? I think they will do whatever it takes to win. This is your family exactly. Victor smoothed his cuffs, a small, contained motion to calm the beast within. When we go in, I take you to my father first. He is traditional. Shake his hand, no kisses. You will call him Mr. Castelli, and if he asks me questions, you answer them. Without hesitation. He values honesty. Even if the honest answer is that I'm only here for your money. Victor's eyes were chips of ice. It was then especially that the silence in the car became a living thing. The Castelli estate rose from the earth not as a home, but as a declaration of war, turning Victor's own mansion into a footnote. It sprawled across 50 acres of tamed wilderness, a monument to a power so old it felt geological. The engine died. Victor stepped out, his hand offered back to her, not a courtesy but a claim. Lena took it, and they walked into the lion's den. The foyer was a cathedral built to Mammon, designed to make you feel small. Marble cold as the grave, gold that bled light from colossal chandeliers. Every surface was a weapon of psychological warfare. The sheer scale of it forced Lena's head back, a physical act of submission to the gods of this place. The moment they crossed the threshold, they were watched. The air itself was an instrument of surveillance. Staff stood like statues in the periphery, their stillness a performance, while men who were not guests guarded every exit with practiced ease. At the center of this web, holding it all together with an unseen gravity, was an old man. Victor's father, Saltare Castelli, at 83, was a study in decay, a frail skeletal thing upon which the skin hung loosely. But his eyes, his eyes were untouched by the rot. They were chips of obsidian, sharp and hungry, dissecting everything they saw. They were the eyes of a man who had decided the life and death of empires. Victor's hand tightened on hers. Was it a warning? Or was he steadying himself? She couldn't know. They made the long walk across the marble floor, each footstep echoing under Salvatore's silent clinical gaze. He gave nothing, no nod, no smile. Father, Victor's voice was tight. This is my wife, Lena. On instinct, Lena offered her hand, a fragile gesture of peace. The grip she received was a shock, impossibly firm, a vicious strength that belied the withered frame of the man. So you're the girl. A dismissal. I'm a woman, actually, Lena corrected, heels, and felt Victor turn to stone beside her. Salvatore's pupils flared for a half-second before a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement escaped his lips. Laughter. Victor said you had a spine. I didn't believe him. He released her, heels. How much did he pay you? The sound in the great room vanished. Every eye turned, and Lena was the specimen under the glass. A test. She knew she could lie. Heels. She could act the part of the outraged, devoted wife. But Victor had warned her. His father feasted on truth. He cleared a debt of $3.2 million. Lena's voice was a calm island in the silence. Heels. He placed my mother in the finest care facility in the state and promised $5 million upon completion. A sharp intake of breath to her left. Lena didn't look. Salvatore's thin lips stretched into a true smile. Honest. A rare commodity. Heels. He turned his gaze back to his son. She'll need it. Your siblings are circling. A fact, not a threat. Marco's wife is 6 weeks pregnant, I know. And you arrive with a bride half your age in a contract we all understand. Salvatore's voice dropped. Heels. A cold, final stone. You are losing, Victor. Heels. Not yet. The margin is razor thin. The old man's eyes found Lena again. Do you understand what you've walked into, girl? Lena met his gaze. For the succession, the winner takes all. And if Victor loses, heels. Then I become a loose end that needs to be tied. Salvatore's rasping laugh came again, this time with a shred of life in it. You told her the truth. I never thought you had it in you. He struck Victor's shoulder, a sharp, jarring blow. Heels. Perhaps you're not as broken as I thought. A muscle leaped in Victor's jaw, but he said nothing. Dinner is in the East Wing, Salvatore declared. Try to survive until dessert. He turned and walked away, leaning on a cane she hadn't noticed until now. Heels. The second he was gone, Victor crowded her space, his voice a low hiss. Heels. What in God's name was that? You said he respects the truth. I didn't say to read our entire contract aloud for the whole family to hear. They already know the terms, you told me yourself. Lena kept her voice a whisper. Heels. To pretend otherwise makes me look like a fool. This way, they know I'm not living in a fairy tale. Victor's eyes searched her face, looking for something. Then it happened. He smiled. Or a ghost of a smile. Heels. A flicker at the corner of his mouth that was gone before it was truly there. You're either the bravest woman I've ever met, or the most foolish. Can't I be both? In this family, you have to be. A woman's voice, smooth as poisoned silk, cut them off. Heels. Victor, darling, how wonderful. They turned. The approaching woman wore her beauty like armor. Mid-40s, perfect, with a smile that never reached her eyes. She moved like a predator. Heels. A calculated, deadly grace. Elena. Victor's voice was devoid of warmth. His sister. Elena's eyes swept over Lena clinical appraisal, and this must be the child bride. How perfectly quaint. Lena felt Victor tense, but she spoke before he could. Heels. Lena Castelli. It's a pleasure. I'm sure it is, dear. Elena's smile widened, showing teeth. Tell me, what's it like to be a walking womb for hire? I imagine it's terribly romantic. About as romantic as marrying for an alliance, Lena returned. Heels. Her voice even. But we all do what we must to get ahead, don't we? A flicker in Elena's eyes. Surprise, or a wound. Victor, you found a clever one. A shame clever won't help when Marco's son is born first. Marco is an imbecile, Victor stated flatly. Heels. His child will be raised by nannies and therapists. Heels. Better than being raised by a father who can't feel love. Elena's smile was now a blade. But that was your experience, wasn't it, brother? Tell me, how did that little experiment turn out? Heels. The air between them crackled with a hatred so old it was foundational. Lena felt the tremors start in Victor's hand and squeezed it, grounding him. We should find our seat, she said, her voice a splash of cool water on the fire. Elena laughed. Yes, Heels. Run along. We wouldn't want to be late. She drifted closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A word of advice, sweetheart. Watch what you eat tonight. You never know what might disagree with you. She floated away, a beautiful angel of death. Heels. I don't like her, Lena said. Get in line. They walked toward the dining hall. Heels. The room was built to crush you. A table set for 30, drowning in crystal and silver, with floral arrangements so perfect they looked sculpted from ice. Place cards dictated their fates. Lena found hers, wedged between Victor and a man she didn't know. Heels. Victor's seat was at the head, a prince beside the king's empty throne. She sat. The man beside her smiled, all white teeth and the heavy scent of expensive cologne. You must be the new Mrs. Castelli. Lena. Marco. He extended a hand. Heels. Victor's younger brother. Lena took it. His grip was a vice, a crude display of power. Congratulations on the baby. Thank you. We're thrilled. Marco's eyes stayed on her. You're younger than I pictured. You're exactly as young as I pictured. Heels. The architecture of Marco's smile began to crumble. Victor always did like the sharp-tongued ones. Did he? I wouldn't know. I'm the first. The first wife, maybe. But don't fool yourself, sweetheart. You're not the first woman in his bed. Heels. Lena's expression was a placid lake. And yet, I'm the one wearing his ring. Marco's jaw went rigid. He opened his mouth to speak, but it materialized in the seat on her other side. The look he shot his brother could have frozen fire. Marco? Victor. Heels. A festive occasion. Father's occasions are never festive. They're battle plans. Victor's hand found Lena's under the table, a single hard squeeze. How is Sophia? Still pretending to be happy. How's your wife? Still pretending not to be terrified. Heels. Lena leaned forward into the space between them. Heels. I'm sitting right here. You can ask me yourself. Both brothers turned to face her. Of you? No. You should be. Why? Because your wife is pregnant? Congratulations. That's not a sign of strength. Heels. It's a sign of desperation. Lena lifted her water glass, a small tremor in her hand, the only sign of the storm. And desperation makes men sloppy. Blood rushed to Marco's face, turning it a deep, ugly red. You little. Careful. Victor's voice was a low, heels, lethal hum. That's my wife you're speaking to. Your wife is a choose your next word as if it's your last, Marco. The entire table had gone dead silent. Everyone was watching. Marco stood abruptly. Excuse me, I need some air. He fled. Heels. Lena put her glass down. Her hand was shaking. Victor's thumb brushed slowly, deliberately across her knuckles. Heels. That was reckless. He started it, and you poured gasoline on the fire. Your instruction was to show no fear. There's a line between confidence and provocation. Perhaps I should have drawn it for you in blood. Lena pulled her hand away. Heels. You threw me in this pit. You told me to play a part. Don't you dare get angry when I write my own lines. Victor's eyes held hers, and then impossibly the corner of his mouth twitched upward again. You are going to get us both killed. Heels. At least it won't be boring. The servants began to move, and the meal began. Salvatore presided over it all from his throne, eating nothing, saying less, while Elena glittered in the middle of the table, charming her prey. Heels. Marco reappeared, his gaze a fugitive, refusing to meet Lena's. Across the table sat his wife Sophia, her pregnancy a heavy, anxious presence. Heels. A flicker of pity sparked in Lena, extinguished just as fast by the memory that this woman's womb held the asset that could sign her own death warrant. The food was exquisite, a procession of flawless courses. Lena ate carefully, Heels, a mirror to Victor's choices, taking only water, and felt Elena's watchful eyes on her, the hint of a smile on the older woman's lips. Between the third and fourth plates, Salvatore rose, tapping his glass. The room went dead. My children, he said, Heels, his voice a papery rasp that somehow filled the space, and their partners. How good it is to have you all beneath one roof. How rare. His eyes scanned them all. I am dying. You know this, and you know what comes next. Heels, succession, legacy, the future of this empire I bled for. A beat of silence. I see some of you hold the high ground, and some do not. Some have gambled boldly, while others have clung to the shore. But make no mistake, the clock is ticking. Heels, and when it stops for me, only one of you will be left standing. He sat. The silence that followed was a physical weight. Then a glass lifted. To family, they all drank, except Lena. Her glass remained untouched on the white linen. Victor saw it. Heels, his voice a low whisper in her ear. Smart, I'm learning. The rest of the meal was a battlefield of pleasantries, politics, business. Insults sharpened to compliments and slid between the ribs. Lena said nothing. Heels, a silent cartographer mapping the shifting lines of power, of loyalty, of hate. Heels. By the time dessert arrived, a headache was blooming behind her eyes. Salvatore stood again. Before you all scatter, he announced, I have one more thing. The air in the room grew thin, tight. In 2 weeks, we hold the annual charity gala. Black tie. Heels. 500 guests, the press, the cameras, the whole circus. His eyes found Victor pinning him in place. I expect you and your new bride to be there. A perfect united front. Victor's face was stone. Of course. Good. Heels. Because the entire city will have its eyes on you, and if you cannot sell them on this marriage, you will never sell me on its value. The unspoken hung in the air, a blade poised to fall. Salvatore sat. Dinner was over. They began to leave, movement slow, heels, deliberate like great cats circling before the kill. Heels. On her way out, Elena paused at their table. Her words to Victor were a threat wrapped in silk. 2 weeks! Do try not to make a mess of it for the family. He gave her a bland smile. Her gaze then slid to Lena, cold and assessing, branding her a liability. Feels, an unknown element in a fatal equation. And liabilities, she said, the words offered like a piece of friendly advice, have a way of getting people killed. After they were gone, Lena's eyes met Sophia's across the emptying room. In that one look, Feels, Lena sought a perfect reflection of her own gilded cage, the shared silent scream of two women trapped in different prisons. Feels. The drive back to the house was swallowed by a punishing silence. The tension radiated from Victor in waves. His jaw was a knot of steel, his posture rigid as he stared out at the passing city lights. Lena wanted to reach for him, Feels, for some anchor in the storm, but she read the violence in his stillness and chose to remain quiet. Inside his movements were a ritual of control. He locked the bedroom door, the bolt shooting home with a heavy thud. Then he went straight for the whiskey, Feels, pouring 2 fingers and downing it in a single desperate motion. When she finally asked what was wrong, a sharp, bitter laugh escaped him first, a sound of pure conflict. Then he looked at her, and the words he spoke were the last thing she expected. Feels. You were perfect, he admitted. She was confident, sharp, unflinching. Feels. His assessment continued, laced with a strange, dangerous awe. You stood your ground with Marco and Elena. You didn't even blink. Then he dropped the bomb. And my father actually liked you. Do you have any idea how impossible that is? Feels. Seeing her confusion, Victor finally laid the problem bare. The problem is that now they see you're not just a decoration, you're a piece on the board, and pieces on the board get taken. He confessed his own catastrophic error in judgment. Feels. He had brought her into this war thinking she was scenery, background noise, but her performance had just promoted her to a combatant. You just painted a bullseye on your own back, Lena, and I don't know how to wipe it off. Her defense, Feels. I did what you told me to do, was not met with reason but with a surge of raw frustration. I'm angry because I misjudged you, he bit out, his voice climbing. I thought you were something that needed to be protected, but you're not. Feels. You took care of yourself, and now I have to figure out how to keep you from getting killed now that everyone in that room sees you as a threat. She could feel her own pulse hammering against her ribs. When she whispered, I didn't ask for this, Feels, his answer was immediate. Neither did I. Silence descended again. Then she moved, closing the space between them, a deliberate act of alliance. She looked up at him, her voice steady. So, what's the plan? Victor's eyes met hers, cold and clear. Feels. We get ready. The target was the gala, a stage with 500 witnesses and 1,000 cameras. His gaze burned into hers, and we make every single person watching believe that we are not just married, we are hopelessly in love. When she asked how, Feels, he simply said, we practice. The breath caught in her throat. Practice what? His hand came up, slow and purposeful, his fingers touching her cheek. Feels. The touch was warm, deliberate. This, he murmured, this comfort between us, looking at each other like we can't be apart. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, a slow, hypnotic motion. Think you can do that? Her skin felt like it was on fire. Feels. A word escaped her, barely a whisper. Try. Lena mirrored the move, placing a hand on his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. He told her to do it again, but this time, to mean it. She obeyed. Feels. Her hand sliding up from his chest into his hair. His pupils blew wide. Better? Better. His other arm snaked around her waist, pulling her flush against him. At the gala, we dance, we touch. We look at each other like the rest of the world has vanished. Feels. Can you sell it? Can you? A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a chilling confession of his own dark talent. I'm an excellent liar, Lena. This isn't lying, it's acting. Feels. It's the same muscle. He erased the last inch of distance between them, their foreheads resting together. 2 weeks. We make them believe, and maybe, just maybe, we get out of this alive. She closed her eyes, feeling his breath on her skin. Feels. Her mind reeling from the clash between the performance and something else. Something terrifyingly real. What if I can't? The question was a fragile thing in the air between them. You did tonight. That was different. That was defiance. Feels. She couldn't find the word for what this was. This is what? Victor pulled back just enough to look into her eyes. The raw proximity had changed something in his own expression, cracking the mask. Yes, I don't know if I can fake that. Feels. Then don't. Her heart stumbled. What? His grip on her tightened, anchoring her. You want this to feel real? Then let it be real. Feels. He spelled out the brutal strategy. Not forever, not the vows, but this. Right now. The touch, the closeness. Stop fighting the current that's already pulling you under. Her denial was instant, breathless. Nothing's happening. Liar. His voice dropped, heels, becoming a rough, intimate gravel. You felt it at the table, when I took your hand, when I stood up for you. When Marco came at you and you came right back, and all I wanted was to break him for daring to speak to you that way. He gave the feeling a name, feels, a clinical diagnosis. Is it possessiveness? Yes. Is it protective? Yes. But it's real, Lena. And if you stop pretending it isn't, this becomes a hell of a lot more survivable. Her throat closed up. She remembered his promise. Feels. You said you could never love me. I won't. Then what is this? Survival, he said, the word a cold, hard fact. I protect my assets. You are my asset. That isn't love, it's a balance sheet. And if we use that, we might just win. Feels. Logic demanded Lena pull back, that she invoke the cold, hard lines of their contract. But the heat of his hand on her and the inferno in his eyes burned through her defenses. For the first time since this sham began, the profound, feels, crushing loneliness receded. Okay, she breathed the word of surrender. He needed to hear it again. Okay? We make it real. The moments. The performance. She tried to claw back some ground to draw a line in the sand, but when it's done, we're done, feels. You walk away. Understood? His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I promise. Lena nodded, then pulled back. His hand dropped from her. She felt the absence of his touch like a sudden chill, a feeling she immediately, violently suppressed. Feels. I'm going to change. He stopped her just before she reached the door. Feels. You were incredible tonight. Victor's voice was a low murmur in the quiet. I need you to know that. A strange heat bloomed in her chest, something warm but dangerous, something she wanted no part of. Feels. She gave a curt nod and turned away before he could see the truth on her face. The next 2 weeks were a new kind of cage. He wove his schedule into hers, sharing meals and working beside her in a calculated campaign of proximity. Feels. It was a slow poisoning of intimacy, this practice. His hand resting on the small of her back, his fingers lacing through hers, a simple adjustment of his collar, each touch a tiny deliberate crack in her defenses. Feels, leaving its mark long after his hand was gone. Feels. One night, with a storm raging outside the library walls, she decided to push. Tell me something true, Lena said, her voice soft against the rain. About you, not the business, not the family, just you. A long silence stretched. Feels. Broken only by the crackle of the fire before he finally asked why. Because if I'm going to make 500 people believe in love with you, she explained, I should know more than the fact that you take your coffee black. Victor closed his laptop. Feels. The sound was a final, metallic click of surrender. What do you want to know? Anything real? He considered this, the firelight playing across his features, then offered a piece of his past. I used to play the piano. The confession surprised her. Feels. Seriously? My mother insisted, before she died. 8 years of classical training. Contempt flickered across his face, a ghost of an expression. I was good, really good. He said he had the potential to make it a career, that others had seen it in him. Feels. When she asked what happened, the answer was a single bitter word. My father. He called music a weakness. Said men like us couldn't afford to be soft. Victor's gaze drifted, lost in a room 30 years away. I haven't touched a piano since. Feels. Lena set her book aside. Do you miss it? Every day. The raw honesty of it hit her, a sudden sharp ache of empathy. She remembered an old instrument in the East Wing and urged him to play it. He fought the idea at first, but she pressed. Feels. Throwing his own words about not disappearing back at him. Feels. Play for me, she commanded softly. He seemed to war himself for a moment before nodding, his voice rough. Don't expect anything beautiful. They found it in the East Wing, a grand piano cloaked in dust and neglect. Victor sat, Feels, his hands hovering over the keys, and then the first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the dead air. The instrument was broken, but what he pulled from it was anything but. She watched his shoulders, so often rigid with tension, Feels, finally relax. His hands moved with a forgotten grace. It was like watching the armor he wore every day dissolve, note by painful note, revealing not the Mafia heir, but a boy buried by duty and loss. Feels. The last note hung in the air, then faded into a profound silence. That was beautiful, Lena whispered. Victor's hands didn't move from the keys. I'd forgotten, he said, his voice thick, what it felt like. When she asked him to explain, Feels, his answer was hollowed out. To be something other than what my father made me. A wave of empathy, stronger this time, pulled her in. On impulse, she sat on the bench beside him, their shoulders brushing. You're more than that. You know that, right? Feels. Victor turned, his face now inches from hers. Am I? Yes. His eyes farted, then stopped. If we keep doing this, getting closer, It's going to make the end so much harder. She knew he was right. I know, feels. He needed to hear it again. And you're okay with that? Her answer was a contradiction, a lie, and a truth tangled together. No, yes, feels. Victor's hand came up, cupping her face. His thumb brushed her bottom lip, a slow, deliberate claim. You are a terrible liar. So are you, she shot back. His reply was telling, a glimpse into the man beneath the monster. I'm an excellent liar, feels. It's the truth I'm no good at. Lena's breath caught a tiny, sharp sound in the quiet room. Then tell me something true now. You terrify me. The confession settled between them, heavy and fragile. Why? She breathed. Feels. Because you make me want things I swore off wanting years ago. He closed the remaining space, a final damning surrender. And I can't afford that. Not ever. Lena shut her eyes, giving in. So what do? We keep pretending, he whispered. Feels, his own grim decree. And when it's over, we walk away. Before this turns into something neither of us can survive. A pact made in the ruins of their resolve. But neither of them moved. Feels. When his lips met hers, softly, carefully, as if she might break, Lena didn't pull away. Feels. She kissed him back, and in that moment, the lie they were living became real. They never spoke of it. Not the next morning when he left before she woke. Not during a game of chess when his hand lingered on hers. Feels. Not over a dinner where the silence was a living thing between them. It was a truth that existed only in the space they shared. The touches became more frequent, instinctual. His hand finding her waist in a crowded room, her fingers brushing his shoulder. Feels. The pillows that had served as a barrier down the middle of the bed disappeared one night, leaving only two people in a space too big for business partners and too small for what they were becoming. Feels. 3 days before the gala, Lena woke to find Victor already dressed, a silhouette against the gray dawn at the window. What time is it? She rasped. 5:30. Why are you up? Couldn't sleep. His back remained to her. Feels. Marco's wife went into labor last night. Lena pushed herself up. What? It's early. 34 weeks. They're at the hospital. His voice utterly flat, devoid of any emotion, a wall built against the unthinkable. If the baby lives, if it's healthy, feels. I lose. The words landed with the weight of a death sentence. Lena got out of bed and went to him. You don't know that yet. I know the odds. Odds are just numbers. Victor finally turned, his face a mask of stone. I have spent 2 months on this. Feels. Contingencies, asset. Feels. And it could all be for nothing before the party even starts. Then we wait, she said, her voice even. We see what happens, and if Marco wins? She felt a tightness in her chest, a familiar coil of fear. Then we deal with it. There is no dealing with it. Feels. Lena, if he gets the succession, you become a liability. The contract is over. He saw only the collapse of his strategy, her life just another piece on the board. Not nothing, she argued, taking his hand. My mother is sober. She's safe. That doesn't change. Feels. She was trying to find a victory in the wreckage. You don't understand. I understand perfectly. You're scared. So am I. But standing here waiting for the world to end isn't helping. Lena stepped closer. How long until you know? Hours. Maybe days. Feels. You can't predict these things. Then we go about our day. Feels. We get ready for the gala as if nothing is different, and when the call comes, we make the next move. Victor just watched her. You're taking this remarkably well. One of us has to. It was the captive soothing the captor, their roles hopelessly blurred. Feels. A faint twitch at the corner of his mouth almost became a smile. When did you get so damn steady? Right around the time you started to unravel. That earned her a real smile, brief as it was. I'm not unraveling. You're spiraling. It's a close cousin. Feels. Lena tugged his hand. Come back to bed. The answers aren't out that window. I don't think I can sleep. Then lie down and worry horizontally. At least I can keep an eye on you. Victor let her lead him back to the bed. Feels. They lay on their sides, facing each other, the bone-deep exhaustion clear in his eyes. I should have picked someone else. For what? This. A vague wave of his hand encompassed the room, the plan, the two of them. Someone harder. Feels. Someone who wouldn't have made me. His voice died. Made you what? Care. The word hung between them, a devastating admission. Lena's breath caught in her throat. Victor, I know. It's not supposed to matter. You're a job. But somewhere along the way, feels, it started to matter, and I don't know how to make it stop. Her own throat felt tight. Maybe you're not supposed to. The validation was a dangerous comfort. That's not helpful. It's the truth. He traced the line of her jaw with his thumb. Feels. When this is done, when you walk away, I'm not going to be okay. Yes, you will. How do you know? Because you're Victor Castelli. You survive everything. She pressed his hand to her cheek. Feels. It's what you do. What if I don't want to just survive anymore? The question was a confession, stripped bare. Lena had no answer for that. Instead, she leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a plan. It was just two people, heels, clinging to each other on the edge of a cliff they both knew they were about to be pushed off of. When they parted, their foreheads rested together. This is a mistake. Probably. We should stop. We should. Neither moved an inch. Heels. The real world broke through at noon. Victor's phone rang, shrill and demanding. He glanced at the screen and his entire body went rigid. Heels. It's my father. Lena's fork clattered against the plate. From across the table, Victor answered the call. Yes. A weighted silence. When? Another stretched pause. And? The silence that followed was an eternity. The muscle in his jaw nodded. Understood. Heels. The call ended. What is it? Lena asked, her voice hushed. The child is alive. A boy. 4 pounds in an incubator. A cold stone dropped in her. The feeling was absolute. So Marco could win. If the boy holds on. If nothing goes wrong. Heels. Victor was on his feet now, pacing, his control finally fracturing for her to see. They're saying it's touch and go. He might live. He might not. We have 72 hours of not knowing. What are we supposed to do? We wait, Heels. And we attend that gala and we smile. Her reply was a mirror of his own resolve. Victor, I'm not done. He stopped his restless movement. This isn't finished until my father names his heir. Heels. And he won't until he knows the boy will live. That gives us time. Lena closed the distance between them. So let's make it matter. The next 2 days felt like holding one's breath underwater. Victor threw himself into a storm of activity, endless calls, Heels, hushed meetings, strategies from which Lena found herself walled off. He looked ravaged, stretched thin, a man running on nothing but the fumes of sheer will. Lena moved around him like a shadow, giving him the quiet he needed, the space he demanded. Heels, offering chess as a silent battlefield. She lost every single match. It was a kind of surrender, a way to keep him steady. The night before the gala, they ate without a word passing between them. Heels. He set his fork down in the middle of the meal. There's something I have to tell you. Lena just looked at him. What? If Marco's child makes it, if I lose this, I'm not just letting you walk away. What are you talking about? Heels. I'm saying the contract is honored. Your mother's debt is gone. You get the money. But you'll be put in protective custody until I'm certain Marco can't get to you. For how long? For as long as it takes. A band tightened around Lena's chest. Heels. That could be months. It could be years. Better be alive and hidden than in the ground. The logic was brutal, absolute. You can't do that. You can't just lock me up. I can. I will. His tone was iron. Heels. Did you really think I'd let you just walk out of here with a target on your back? He will kill you, Lena. Heels. Maybe not tomorrow, but it will happen. And I won't allow it. So that's it? I'm your prisoner for the rest of my life? You're alive for the rest of your life. There's a difference. Lena shoved her chair back from the table. This is completely insane. Heels. This is the world we live in, Victor said, getting to his feet. You do not get to die just because I lost. That isn't how your story is going to end. You don't get to write my ending. Actually, the contract says I do. Until it's terminated. Heels. Your safety is my responsibility. A cold, hard assertion of power wrapped in the language of a legal document. Her outburst was inevitable. I hate you. No, you don't. Right now, I do. Victor came to her then, his hands coming up to frame her face. Heels. Hate me as much as you need to, but you are going to survive this. Heels. Even if I don't. He said it like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. What is that supposed to mean? It means, should Marco win, I become a liability. Liabilities are dealt with. Victor. I'm not an idiot, Lena. I know the rules of this game. Heels. If I lose, I've got maybe 6 months before a tragic car crash, a sudden heart attack, some kind of convenient end. His thumbs traced the line of her cheekbones. But you will live. That part is not up for discussion. It was a martyr's reasoning, Heels, twisting his control into a final act of sacrifice. Stop talking as if you're already in a coffin. I'm talking like a man who sees the board clearly. Then fight harder. I am fighting. I have been fighting since the moment I saw you. Heels. But you can't win every war, Lena. And if this is the one I lose, I have to know you are safe. I need you to stop sounding so defeated. This isn't defeat. It's realism. Realism is just a prettier word for giving up. Lena pulled back from his touch. Heels. You told me you protect what belongs to you. Then protect yourself. Because if you die, I don't just move on. I live the rest of my life knowing you died, because I wasn't enough to make you fight to stay alive. The hostage, Heels, now demanding the jailer save himself, not for his own sake, but to preserve the twisted reality they had built. Victor just stared. You think this fight isn't for you. I think you're fighting for a contract, for duty, for your pride, not for this. Heels. She laid her palm flat against his chest. Heels. Not for whatever this turned into. And what did it turn into? Lena's voice cracked on the words. You tell me. The air was thick with everything unsaid. Then he was pulling her into an embrace so tight it felt like it could break her ribs. Heels. I don't know what this is, he murmured into her hair. I just know I never saw it coming. I know it terrifies me. And I know if anything happens to you because of me and my world, I will burn it all to ash. A vow of pure possessive fury, not of love. Heels. Lena's arms wrapped around him. Then don't die. I'll try my best. Promise me. Lena, promise me, Victor. He drew back, his eyes locking with hers. I promise I will fight like hell to live. It was the only real thing he had to give her. Heels. The subject, Lena, was roused at 0700 hours, her day already laid out for her like a blueprint. A classic maneuver of control, stripping away choice to breed reliance. Victor's absence was itself a message. Heels. He governed now through written orders, not conversation. A proxy, a woman named Mrs. Kozlov, presented the day's instructions along with an envelope, another layer of cold distance. Inside, the note and a velvet box worked in tandem. Heels. The note was an order. The ring, a family heirloom he claimed was never worn, was meant to forge an instantaneous, unearned bond of intimacy and duty. This wasn't a gift. It was a collar. Heels. Lena's inspection of the object is noted. A ring of simple, clean elegance, which she saw through the distorted lens of a romantic promise. Heels. The tremor in her hand was a clear sign of the war in her mind, the gulf between the grim reality of her situation and the symbolic hope this object offered. The day's events were nothing less than the systematic deconstruction of her identity. Heels. A stylist. A dress designed to provoke. Heels that added 4 inches of height. Jewels that carried their own insurance policy. Every detail served to erase the woman she was. Heels. Her inability to recognize her own face in the mirror was a textbook case of depersonalization. She was no longer a person. She was an asset, polished and prepared for Victor's world. The ride to the gala alone was designed to heighten her isolation. Heels, leaving him as her only anchor. Heels. Her arrival unleashed a wave of anxiety, the expected outcome of deploying the subject into a high-threat environment without her handler. The twisting in her stomach was a purely physical manifestation of this distress. Heels. Victor's entrance was deliberately timed to let her fear crest, casting him in the role of savior. His appraisal, "You look stunning," was not a compliment. It was confirmation that his asset met all specifications. His next words, "You're early," Heels, were a quiet, masterful stroke of psychological warfare, twisting reality to assert his control over the very fabric of time and place. Heels. His hand found the small of her back, a public claim of ownership. The words that followed were the rules of engagement for their shared performance. "Use it," he said of her terror, a sociopath's guide to weaponizing emotion. His command, Heels. Don't give them a single real thing. Except for each other was a masterclass in manipulation. He was creating a shared delusion, a world where the bond between them was the only truth in a room full of lies. They were on stage for hours. Heels. Victor guided her through a sea of faces whose names didn't matter. She was his new, interesting prop, a piece on the board in his war for succession, a part she played under the constant, guiding pressure of his hand. Heels. Then the antagonist, Elena, appeared. Her approach was a finely honed probe aimed directly at Victor's weakest point, his anxiety over his rival's newborn son. The involuntary tightening of Victor's grip on Lena's back was a dead giveaway. Heels. Elena's barb was meant to fracture their united front, but Lena's response was something else entirely. She didn't defend. She attacked. Heels. Aiming a verbal blade at Elena's own festering wound, her perpetual childhood and her desperate hunger for her father's approval. For a subject so new to this arena, it was a shockingly skillful act of psychological combat. Heels. Elena's reaction was a smile that didn't reach her eyes, a momentary slip of the mask that proved Lena's words had found their mark. The ghost of a laugh Victor tried to smother was all the encouragement Lena needed. "You're going to get us killed." "Heels," he murmured, but his tone was laced with admiration. He valued this kind of beautiful, dangerous risk. He pulled her onto the dance floor, a public ritual to cement their alliance. There, he led her through the slow, Heels, deliberate motions of a romantic waltz, reasserting his physical dominion. Their steps fell into a perfect unspoken rhythm, the physical expression of a trauma bond hardening into something unbreakable. Heels. The words they exchanged during the dance were a confession. Victor spoke of his training in both etiquette and violence, normalizing the monstrous duality of his world. His offhand comment, "And you're beautiful," heals, was a perfectly timed dose of affection, a powerful instrument of intermittent reinforcement designed to bind her ever closer. He saw her evolution with chilling clarity. She was learning to turn fear into a weapon. This wasn't praise for her bravery, heals. It was an acknowledgement of her successful assimilation into his brutal reality. The pride in his eyes was not for a partner, but for a creation that was finally becoming what he had designed it to be, heals. A tear escapes, a brief, glittering betrayal of his approval, but she swallows it back down. Moments like this, her voice is a strained whisper. They make pretending harder. And in this, the beautiful tragedy of their bond, heals. The dance was a world built for two, a fragile bubble where everything outside simply ceased to exist. Here they were safe. Here this was real. Then the illusion shatters with the arrival of the patriarch, Salvatore Castelli, heals. He is the ghost at this feast, the architect of all their pain, and the light in the room seems to die with his presence. The warmth evaporates from Victor's body. The hunter is back. The stage is set, heals. "Are you happy?" Salvatore's voice cuts the air. "Or just very good actors?" A question aimed like a weapon. Before Victor can even breathe, Lina steps into the line of fire. She explains it all, a perfectly constructed story of how their simple feels, brutal transactions somehow blossomed into truth. A necessary lie she tells herself to survive the night. Finding Victor's hand is an anchor in the storm she just created. "What we're acting out," she insists, her eyes pleading. "That part is real," heals. A desperate, heartbreaking defense of the beautiful cage she now calls home, heals. The patriarch turns his attention back to the matter of succession, a blade he knows just how to twist in his son's side. Hearing Salvatore's cold dissection, Lina not as a prisoner, but as the chosen one, a masterful act of self-preservation, finding power where there is none. She feels the tension coiling in Victor's muscles, a silent signal, and she moves to stand with him, her choice made. His fight is her fight now, his damnation, her own. The transformation is heals. Salvatore's diagnosis is as sharp and cruel as a scalpel. He sees this connection for what it is, a weakness, a flaw in the design that will bring the whole house down. He warns that Victor must be ready. His stare is a physical weight measuring his son, heals, searching for the monster he raised. Then comes the final, terrible question. Is he willing to burn it all down, to sacrifice himself, to keep this one thing he now claims? It's a test of purity. Has this woman corrupted the perfect, heals, power-hungry narcissism at his core, heals? The old man's warning hangs in the air like poison. They'll use her against you. He paints the future in blood and ashes, forcing the impossible choice, the woman or the crown. This is the moment the entire tragedy has been building toward, heals. Victor's answer comes without a flicker of hesitation, cold as the grave. "Then I pick her." He doesn't say he loves her, he says she's mine. This isn't a surrender, it is the ultimate declaration of his own divine right, heals, valuing a single possession over an entire empire, a final act of defiance against the father who made him, heals. A collective breath is stolen from the room, a shockwave. Salvatore spits the word fool, the classic judgment of a man who sees emotion as nothing but a strategic error. But then, a pivot, a dark and subtle shift. He offers Victor a way out, a whisper of a solution, the infant rival Inigi, room 412. He speaks of unfortunate accidents, the shadows, and plausible deniability. A final, horrific test. Is his son still ruthless enough to do what must be done to seize the throne? Heals. A raw animal horror claws its way up Lina's throat. A sound from a world where morality still means something. Victor stands perfectly still, a statue carved from conflict. His refusal is quiet but absolute. "I won't. Not that. Never that." Heals. A line is drawn in the sand, a boundary his father never believed he had. "I'm not my father," he declares, and in that moment he becomes something else entirely. He will not sacrifice a child, not for anything. For Lina, watching him, heals. This refusal is not a choice. It is salvation, a truth that binds her to him more profoundly than any embrace. Heals. Victor reached for her hand, a gesture meant to soothe the storm. "We wait," he commanded. He speaks of hoping the rival's child survives, a strange conflict of honor warring with the brutal reality of his world. Heals. The contingency plan he lays out isn't for him, it's for her, always for her. A perfect, polished manipulation. But Lina pushes back, her voice finding new strength. She demands a choice, a life, not just survival. Heals. A negotiation from within the heart of the gilded cage. In response, Victor just pulls her closer, a silent answer that says everything. She is his. Heals. I promise. The gala unfolded as a masterpiece of curated appearances, the two of them moving through the crowds, playing the part of a couple in love. When the photographer asked for a kiss, Victor leaned in without a thought, heels, a performance so seamless it felt like truth. For Lena, it was. The camera's flash burned away the last of the pretense. This was real. The diagnosis was undeniable. Whatever came next would shatter them both, a storm neither was ready for. Heels. The call came at 0300. Lena watched Victor on the bed, his shoulders rigid with tension. The voice on the other end was clipped. Urgent. Heels. Victor listened, his face a mask, and ended the call. What happened? Lena asked, already sitting up. He didn't look at her. Marco's son died an hour ago, respiratory failure. The words were sterile, a coroner's report. This news, a strategic victory, Heels, lands in the room with the weight of a coffin. A child is dead. I'm sorry, Lena whispered, the only human response. Victor's was not. Don't be. I'm not. His voice was flat, empty. That child's death just saved both our lives. He pauses, Heels, almost questioning the grim gratitude he feels. A flicker of something. Lena tries to save him from it, calling him a survivor, Heels. A monster, he corrected her, and there it was. He sees the darkness in himself while she fights to pretend it isn't there, to protect the man she needs him to be. A chasm between them. He finally met her gaze, and his eyes were hollowed out, empty, Heels. He began to pace, the caged anxiety given motion, laying out the threats circling them now, his siblings, Elena and Dominic. The fight is no longer simple. Hearing the despair in his voice, Lena offers the impossible. Stop fighting, Heels. A desperate plea for an escape that was never an option. That's not how this works. Heels. Why not? She begged. His answer was brutal and clear, a perfect understanding of the prison they were born into. Because walking away doesn't mean they stop coming. Escape isn't freedom. It's just a slower death. He sees it all. Then he moves, Heels, the energy shifting from defense to attack. He kneels before her, not in surrender, but in command. We finish this. He paints a new future, a crusade. He'll win, and then he will burn his father's corrupt world to the ground. Heels. He can't cure the sickness of his family, but he will cut it out with fire. Heels. He speaks of his mother, of the other women trapped in this family, casting himself not as a killer seizing power, but as a savior, a redeemer. Lena responds without a word, pulling him into an embrace. Heels. A silent vow of her complete and total allegiance to this new gospel. You're not dying, she says, a command against fate itself. You don't get a vote. Watch me. A ghost of a laugh escapes him, a crack in the tension. Lena gives their bond a new name, Heels. Not captive. Partner, is that what we are, he asks? And her answer seals their shared destiny. Now this is something to die for. Heels. The kiss that follows is a contract signed in blood. A promise. He lays out the coming war, predicting every move from Elena, from Dominic, from his father. He tells her they will try to kill him. It's a final test. Lena feels her stomach twist into knots, but her voice is steady. Then we make sure you survive. When he asks, we? She takes their original fraudulent vows and makes them real. For better or for worse. She will not be a damsel to be hidden away. She is in the fire with him now. Heels. Victor's acceptance is a quiet thing. Okay, you're in. He immediately sets the terms of this new war, his voice hard. You follow my lead. If I tell you to run, you run. She agrees. A pact. They stayed like that until the light broke, 2 soldiers waiting for the battle, the air thick with what was to come. At noon, the patriarch, Salvatore, appeared before the world to confirm the fight for the throne was not over. He looked, they said, like a man already dead. The media descended like vultures. Heels. As the dust of one betrayal settled, the jackals began to circle. Elena, a perfect mirror of his own ambition, struck first. Her statement a stiletto slid between his ribs, a move of exquisite calculation. Dominic, ever the shadow, echoed the blow. Heels. Only Marco, the broken one, offered the dignity of his silence. From the solemn quiet of the library, where light filtered through dusty panes, Lena watched the pieces move on the board, a silent observer to Victor's unseen war. Heels. The feeling of being utterly useless was a cold weight in her stomach, deepening her reliance on him. She could only do the one thing left to her. She could wait. The real assault began 3 days later, not with a fist, but with the silent, Heels, venomous spread of information. Heels. It arrived as an exposé, a masterwork of character assassination built on anonymous whispers and the hard truth of Victor's financial sins, painting a portrait of a man rotted by corruption. Every word was true. Heels. Its only purpose was the complete obliteration of his name. Lena found him in the tomb of his office, his focus absolute, his eyes locked on the glowing screen that pronounced his doom. His face was a mask carved from ice. Heels. He knew the hand that held the knife. Alina leaked it. The words were flat, devoid of hope. Nothing. There's nothing to do. He saw the end then, a clear and brutal vision of the legal and political ruin that would surely follow. Heels, the inevitable checkmate. Heels. He had already accepted the loss, the finality of it. I'm done, Lena. Her response was a single sharp crack in the silence, a violent negation of his surrender. No. She crossed the room, a blur of motion, her hands finding his face. Heels. Forcing his gaze away from the abyss. It was a shattering reversal of their world. The captive, refusing to let her captor die from the wound to his own pride, was now the one demanding he fight. Her own voice was a tremor, a fragile thing. Heels. You told me you wanted to change things, she whispered, forcing him to remember the myth he had spun for them both, the savior he was meant to be. Heels. This isn't a punch. This is a knockout, he breathed, the words tasting of ash. Only if you stay down, she shot back, her eyes burning into his, trying to light a fire in the wreck of him. Her command was primal, an order to his very soul. Get up, Heels. In the face of his utter collapse, a desperate, brilliant madness took root in her. I suggest we stop playing their game, she said, her voice low and intense, and start playing ours. She didn't propose denial. She proposed a baptism in fire. Heels. Embrace the accusations, own them. The word insane formed on Victor's lips, a logical response to a strategy born of chaos. But in their world of lies, Lena knew a horrifying truth could be the most revolutionary weapon of all. Heels. She laid it bare for him. By shedding the costume of innocence, he could seize a power they could never anticipate. What if you stopped pretending? Silence hung in the air, thick and heavy. He was processing. Then, Heels. A sound cracked the icy stillness, a laugh, beginning as a tremor and building into a raw, unhinged torrent that broke the catatonic spell. The sheer absurdity of confessing to felonies on national television was a madness he could almost taste. Heels. Is it working? Lena's soft question pulled him back from the edge, and then he moved, pulling her into his lap, his kiss a brutal collision of control and surrender, a reassertion of dominance, even as he ceded his fate to her strategy. Heels. You're either a genius or completely insane, he murmured against her lips. Heels. If I do this, he said, the reality crashing in, there's no going back. He could see them coming for him, the law from one side, his family from the other. Then we make sure you're bulletproof, Lena vowed, her words forging a bond between them in the fire. Heels. We? He asked, the word full of a fragile hope. We. The kiss, not a promise, was softer, an acceptance, a sealing of their pact. Okay. We do it your way. With his consent, the tactical mind re-engaged. Heels. The old Victor flickering back to life. But we need leverage. He knew that to walk through this inferno and survive, he needed a bomb strapped to his chest, a dead man's switch that would take everyone else down with him. The next move was not a play. Heels, it was total war. Heels. Victor had been preparing for this his whole life. He possessed an archive, a meticulous catalog not just of his own sins, but of the entire rotting edifice of his family. Elena, Dominic, the patriarch himself, every sordid deal, every laundered dollar. Heels. Every hidden sickness was documented. He was preparing to detonate the entire system. The press conference was set for a Friday, a spectacle for the weekend news cycle. He hired the best public relations firm not to spin story, Heels, but to ensure the explosion was seen by the entire world. On the morning, Lena found Victor already dressed, his suit and tie a kind of armor for the coming sacrifice. Ready? She asked. No. But we proceed. He held out his hand. Accompany me, Heels, to the conference? To all of it. I need you there. Victor, my being there changes the narrative. Heels. It makes this about us instead of, it is about us. It is about choosing the one true thing in a universe of lies. His eyes held hers. Please. Lena took his hand, the simple gesture a profound act of surrender. They walked into the hotel ballroom together. Heels. A fevered dream of media, a crush of reporters, the blinding staccato of camera flashes. They placed Lena in the front row, his anchor in the storm. Victor stepped to the podium, and he began. My name is Victor Castelli, Heels. I am the firstborn son of Salvatore Castelli, and for the last 30 years I have been a willing participant in an empire built on corruption, violence, and human ruin. A silence so deep it was deafening fell upon the room. Victor's face was a mask. Heels, his eyes fixed on the cold, dark lenses before him. I have laundered money. I have bribed public officials. Heels. I have used illegal means to secure contracts, giving my family an advantage rooted in pathology. I have done things that have stolen my sleep and fractured my soul. A reporter started to shout a question. Victor simply raised a hand. Feels, and the room fell silent again. I am not finished. He let the pause hang in the air. This is the end of the pretense. The end of my role in a system that feeds on people and shits out money. Feels. And I will no longer stand by and watch my family destroy lives to protect a name. He produced a single USB drive, holding it up for the cameras to see. This contains the proof. Every transaction, every bribe. Not just mine. Everyone's, my father. Feels. Our partners. The full rotten scope. Feels. Victor's voice never wavered. A clinical, detached instrument of destruction. This information will be delivered to federal authorities the moment I step out of this room, and I will cooperate with every aspect of the investigation that follows. Feels. The room exploded. A tidal wave of questions, of shouting, of noise. Victor seemed not to hear it. He was immune. His gaze cut through the chaos and found Lena. This is the lesson, his eyes told her, that to survive is not the same as to live. Feels. That being trapped in a corrupt world does not mean you cannot burn it to the ground. That the only way to change a rotten thing is to turn it to ash. He stepped away from the podium. Security swarmed him, a human shield guiding him to the exit. Feels. Lena pushed through the frantic crowd, reaching his side just as they broke free into the open air. Feels. You did it, she breathed. I just ended my life as I know it. You just started a new one. Victor pulled her close, his voice urgent. Whether I survive the next 48 hours depends on whether we survive. We'll survive. They got in the car. Feels. Returned to the gilded cage of the estate, and they waited for the world to end. The blowback was immediate. Federal agents arrived that evening, their presence quiet and professional. They had warrants. They asked questions. Victor gave them everything. Feels. Holding nothing back. They left with mountains of evidence and his promise to testify. Before midnight, his father publicly disowned him. A formal decree announced that Victor Castelli had been excised from the family, his name erased. Feels. His inheritance gone. Elena and Dominic had lawyers on retainer within the hour. Marco was silent, and Lena never left Victor's side. Feels. 3 months. The investigation was a grueling passage of 3 months of sworn depositions and sworn testimony. The world split its opinion, painting Victor as a messiah to some, a Judas to others. The threat level was palpable. Feels. His security detail was doubled, but something strange began to happen. The public started to see past the man to the sickness he had exposed. Not just the crimes, but the rot in the system that had allowed it all to fester. Victor became a paradox. Feels. A symbol of the man who had everything, and chose to burn it all down rather than live with the lie. When the indictments came, when Elena and Dominic were arrested, when Salvatore himself was charged and confined to his home, Feels. Victor took the plea deal they offered him. Feels. Community service. Fines that would strip him of his wealth. Probation. But not a single day in a cell. The prosecution called him the star witness, the man whose testimony tore down a criminal empire that had operated above the law for decades. Feels. Victor called it survival. Lena, in a state of devotion that defied clinical labels, called it a second chance. 6 months after the world ended, they stood together as the Castelli estate was dismantled piece by piece. The family home, Feels. Salvatore's throne room was being liquidated. Assets seized, property sold, the entire legacy systematically erased. How does it feel? Lena asked. Victor looked out at the bones of the place that had built him and broken him. Empty, he said. Feels. And light. What's next for us? Whatever we want. He finally turned to face her. The contract is broken. Feels. It has been since the moment my father declared I was no longer his son. You're free, Lena. Take the money I set aside for you. Go. Start over. Lena flinched, a tremor of panic running through her. Is that what you want? What I want, he said. Feels, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, is for you to have a choice, a real one, not a cage, not a contract. And if I choose to stay, a breath hitched in Victor's chest, a tiny human sound. Feels. Then I would spend the rest of my life making sure you never regretted it. Lena closed the small space that was left between them. I'm not leaving. Lena, I'm not leaving, she repeated, her voice firm. Not because of a contract or because I'm trapped, Feels, but because somewhere between the mind games, the press conferences, and the nights you held me while I cried, I stopped wanting to leave. Her hand found his. You asked me once what this was between us. Feels. We are, I think, two people who found each other in the wreckage and chose to build a better world from the ashes, together. Victor drew her close, his arms a desperate circle around her. Feels, as if she was the last solid thing in a universe that had crumbled to dust. I don't deserve you. That might be true, but you're mine all the same. He laughed then, a real laugh, one that reached his eyes. What do we do now? We begin. We build something new. Feels. Something that isn't founded on blood and lies and fear. It's a tall order. You wanted to change an empire. I'm suggesting you change yourself. Become something more than what he made you. Victor looked down at her, the question in his gaze. Feels. And you'll help me every step. Even when it's hard, especially then. He kissed her. It was a kiss of certainty, of quiet promise. Feels. A kiss with no agenda, no performance. It was just two souls choosing each other when they no longer had to. When he pulled away, a smile touched Lena's lips. So what's first? First, we get married. For real. No contract, no arrangement. The real thing. Feels. We are married. That was business. I need this to be true. Lena's eyes glistened. Are you asking me? I'm promising you that if you'll have me, if you'll have a man who is broken and rebuilding and a long way from perfect, Feels. I will spend the rest of my life making you glad you did. Yes, 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 you idiot. Of course, the answer is yes. Victor swept her off her feet, spinning her in a circle, and for the first moment since they'd met, he looked young. He looked weightless. Feels. He looked free. Feels. The wedding happened 2 weeks later, a quiet affair. No press, no cameras. Just the two of them, a justice of the peace, and Mrs. Kozlov bearing witness. Lena in a simple white dress, Victor in a dark suit. Feels. They spoke vows they had written themselves, promises that were real and hard and worth making. And when the judge pronounced them husband and wife, when Victor kissed her as if the world had narrowed to that single point of contact, Feels. Lena felt something that had been gone for a year. She felt hope. The next part was harder. Victor used what money he had left to start a foundation, a place that gave resources to people trapped in lives like the one Lena had known. Debt relief, Feels. Legal counsel, a safe place to land, a way out for those who thought there was none. Lena was right there with him, her mind for numbers keeping the entire operation honest and afloat. Feels. They were building. It was slow work, flawed work, but it was theirs. And then, 3 months after they spoke their vows, Lena realized her period was late. She took 3 tests. They were all positive. She sank to the bathroom floor, Feels. The little plastic wands lined up before her, and felt the world tilt on its axis. A child, the biological term demanded by the contract. The very thing that had started it all. Only now, it wasn't a clause to be fulfilled. It was a choice, a future. Feels. It was real. She found Victor in his study. He glanced up as she entered. Hey, you okay? Lena held out the test. Victor went perfectly, utterly still. Is that it is? All 3 of them. He rose, crossed the floor, Feels, and his hands trembled as he took the small object from her. Feels. You're pregnant, I am. We're having a baby. We are. Victor looked from the test to her face, then back again, the reality dawning in his eyes. I'm going to be a father. A real one. Not the version in the contract. Feels. The kind who shows up and stays and doesn't use his own children like pieces on a board. His eyes began to water. Actual tears. I don't know how to do that. Neither do I. But we'll figure it out together. Feels. Victor pulled her into a hug so tight she could barely breathe. I'm so scared. Me too. What if I'm terrible at this? Then you'll fix it. That's what people get to do. Lena pulled back to look him in the eye. You are not your father, Victor. Feels. You are choosing to be something else. And that choice is the only thing that matters. You really believe that? I know it. Feels. Because I watched you burn your whole world down just to build a better one. And if you can do that, you can be the father this child needs. Victor rested his forehead against hers. I love you. The words hung in the air between them. Feels. Spoken for the very first time. Lena smiled, her own tears finally breaking free. I love you too, even though I'm a mess, especially because you are. It means you're human, and humans get to screw up and learn and try again. Feels. That's a very generous view of humanity. I learned it from a man who chose redemption over an empire, so it's your fault. Victor laughed and kissed her. We're really doing this, we are. Building a life, raising a child. The whole thing. Feels. Together. Feels. Their lives merged. The child, a girl they named Anna, arrived 7 months later. She was a healthy infant, a tangible biological anchor for their new reality. In the sterile light of the hospital room, Lena was consumed by a profound, Feels, chemical wave of maternal connection. Victor, the father, simply stared at the child, a fixation typical of a narcissist confronting something he created but could not possibly control. His fears, voiced in whispers, what if I drop her? Feels. And what if she doesn't like me? Were the classic echoes of his own inadequacy. Lena's calm replies soothed him, cementing her role as the emotional bedrock of this newly formed triad. Feels. When the infant's tiny hand instinctively closed around his finger, a primitive neurological reflex, It sparked a profound emotional shift in the father. Heals. His whispered vow, "I promise I'm going to do better than mine did," was a conscious severing of a generational curse. Lina felt her throat tighten, recognizing the gravity of the moment. They stood there for a long time, a quiet, impenetrable unit. Feels. The transactional past dissolving into a deeply connected present. Lena's mother's arrival a year later was the first disruption. Their new home, which she noted was warmer, symbolized their move away from a fortress and into a life. Her question, Feels, "You did all this?" was a test of the new dynamic. Feels, "I don't know if I should thank you or hate you." It was the perfect expression of a mind at war with itself. Victor's response, "Both is fair," was a masterfully calibrated admission of guilt. Feels, a move designed to disarm the past while claiming the present. He was recasting the story as a success. Her mother's correction, "I'm grateful," that's different. Feels, laid bare her internal conflict between her daughter's clear happiness and the violent origins of it all. Lena stepped between them, the natural mediator managing the fragile peace. The three generations, a complex system of trauma, Feels, had just entered a delicate stage of repair. Later alone, the two of them finally dissected their own history. Feels, "Do you ever regret it?" Victor's questions, a careful probe, testing the foundation of their world. Lena's denial was immediate, a classic symptom of a captive who has reframed trauma as the necessary crucible for a better life. Feels, she had fully absorbed the story that her survival and this happiness could only have been born from that initial horror. Her confession, especially because it was terrifying, is how trauma romanticizes itself. Victor's quiet acknowledgement, Feels, "I was supposed to be your captor," was a final, verbal nod to the original power structure, which had since mutated into a strange and binding codependency, where captor and caregiver were now one and the same. Feels, Lena's version of their history was a narrative she had carefully built to reclaim her own power. The moral is that nothing is permanent except the choices we make. A stunning piece of cognitive reframing. Feels, she argued they both made a conscious choice to break from their programming, and in doing so, they made their new life legitimate. He could have stayed the monster his father raised. She could have run. Feels, that they didn't. That was the choice their shared reality was built on. Victor's silent acceptance of this story signaled his total assimilation into their new world, cementing the bond between them. Feels, the foundation they built became an outlet, channeling their dark experiences into a socially acceptable project. Her mother's new sobriety and Victor's return to playing music were more proof of their successfully constructed life. Feels, their arguments didn't vanish, they were just managed, a sign the core pathologies still hummed quietly beneath the surface. The central principle of their union remains that continuous, daily choice. It is a constant mental act, Feels, a reaffirmation of their commitment against all other, easier paths. This relentless active decision is the very engine that sustains their profoundly impossible relationship. Feels, Lena's gratitude for this change in him becomes a lifeline, reinforcing the idea of a man reformed. And his response, a quiet thanks for seeing a man worth the effort, solidifies her role as his savior. A dark, symbiotic dance. Feels, this fragile truce is essential for them both. Her claim of being stubborn enough is an acceptance of this strange new duty. In time, their very breathing falls into a shared unconscious rhythm, a final sign of two souls hopelessly entangled. Feels, the end of the day isn't just the closing of a chapter, it's the quiet click of a lock, reaffirming the beautiful fragile cage they had built for themselves, bar by gilded bar. Feels, it began in Shadow and Steel, a story etched in the cold language of captor and captive, a transaction sealed not with ink but with fear. The sickness of it was brutally simple. Yet, time, that relentless solvent, Feels, wore away the sharp edges of their beginning. What remained was not forgiveness but function, a quiet, grim partnership that took root in the ruins, one that not only survived but built a fragile mythology they called healing. Feels, from the shattered pieces of what was, they constructed a new truth, a careful architecture upon the bedrock of their trauma that granted them a strange, unnerving peace. In the final quiet frame, Feels, one must concede that this monstrous thing they built works. Born of a wound, yes, but it is a complete and breathing adaptation. For them, it is the only world. It is everything.